Welcome back. Can you hear me? Yes. So welcome to our second session in this Symposium Performing Society at the Museum for Modern Arts in Frankfurt. That is devoted to the logics, algorithms, and networks of today's societies that are interweaved and pervaded by computational and mathematical calculations of the capitalist market, as we will hear in a minute. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Tiziana Terranova. Tiziana Terranova is Associate Professor of Cultural Studies and Digital Media at the University of Naples L'Orientale. She's also the co-founder and member of the Technoculture Research Unit, a project that discusses the relation between culture and technology. Terranova's research explores the impact that information technologies have on our societies, as well as on politics. She's especially interested in digital labor and digital culture. Tiziana Terranova has published numerous essays and reviews for newspapers, magazines, and journals, such as, for instance, Il Manifesto, Mute, Social Text, and Studi Culturale. In 2004, she has published her important study entitled Network Culture, Politics of the Information Age with Pluto Press. Her new book, Hypersocial, is forthcoming with Minnesota University Press, and another book entitled Neurocapital with Semiotext. Tiziana Terranova, thank you once again for joining us. I'm now more than excited to hear more about your newest insights in your talk, Hypersocial Planetarization. Welcome.
First of all, I would like to thank the organization, everybody involved, from the director, Suzanne, to Anna, and Nadine, and everybody who has taken Lucas, has taken such good care of us throughout this last few days. So thank you very much, very, very appreciated. Okay, I'm going to take you on a train of thought, which I've been developing in my ongoing research, which started when I kind of became really fascinated by the way the term social had made a comeback on the internet with the rise of social media platforms in the late 2000s. This was something that was picked up by many cultural theorists, but that, since then has been kind of left in the background as what seemed more urgent concerns, such as surveillance, algorithmization, automation had taken over. But I kind of stayed with it, so I want to take you on my train of thought to see why I think, staying with the social is still important. I want to start with the idea that terms such as social and society have historically come to stand for visions of political change that express the primacy of the collective over the individual, whether one is talking about the production of wealth, with Marxist perspective about the source being social cooperation and social labor, rather than primarily individual initiative as entrepreneurs in neoclassical economic thinking, or the larger historical and structural causes of inequalities and oppression, as in class, gender, race, or the capacity for collective action, as in social movements. The primacy of the social over the economic, the notion that the well-being of everybody, starting with the most oppressed, exploited, and marginalized, should be the point of view from which politics is conceived, it identifies the idea of the left. In a sense, the decline of the left as a political ideal, or its inability to actually become the driver of political change, rather than catching up with nationalist ideologies or market-oriented political rationalities, has also been caused by, or maybe resulted from, the decline of the idea of the social, as in socialism and social democracy. We can find this decline or downright rejection, for example, in neoliberal thinkers such as Friedrich von Hayek, and his notion that the social is a vague notion with the comparison to the primary empirical evidence of the reality of the individual. Or in a famous statement by neoliberal politician Margaret Thatcher, that there is not such a thing as society, but only individuals and their families. In the late 1970s, postmodern philosopher Jean Baudrillard proclaimed that we are living in the age of the end of the social. And this was the other title of this book, In the Shadow of the Silent Majorities, or The End of the Social. At best, the social was for Baudrillard a modern simulacrum that depended on the existence of a specific type of space, perspective, representation, graspable from a single point of view, as from above, such as exemplified, for example, not just from the panopticon that Foucault described, but also by the layout of the industrial factory floor, from the point of view of management from above, a speciality which for Baudrillard was now, in the postmodern late 1970s, dissolving in a space of pure circulation. Taking as its image of the postmodern social Los Angeles highway system, with its isolated and enclosed drivers caught in the pure circuitous movement of circulation, Baudrillard suggested that the social might have become, at best, just a functional utility, and that socialism, capitalism, media, and information had all contributed to this end by the sheer endless production of the social, a kind of entropy of the social that he called hypersocial. In the late 1970s, however, another post-structuralist philosopher, Michel Foucault, who Baudrillard invited to forget in the same years, was also proposing his own perspective on the emergence, and possibly also the decline, not so much of the social, but of the idea of society as such, as a specific domain. In his characteristic empiricist epistemology of knowledge, where everything that exists kind of emerges at some point, Foucault proposed that society should be considered something whose reality is of the same order as of other terms which had been the focus of his research, such as sexuality or madness. It was not so much that society did not exist, as Baudrillard argued, but that it exhibited all the features of something that he called transactional realities. That is, transactional and transitorial figures, which, although they have not always existed, are nonetheless real. They are born precisely from the interplay of relations of power and everything which constantly eludes them, at the interface of governors and governed. So this is Foucault. Society as a transactional and transitorial reality was born for Foucault in mid-18th century Europe, after the Westphalian Treaty, which established peace between European countries, making the world the object of context, as we heard also yesterday. In particular, with the writing of liberal thinkers such as Adam Smith or Adam Ferguson. And yet, for Foucault, society was not primarily a philosophical idea, but a concept of governmental technology, or rather, the correlate of a technology of government that we call liberalism. Liberalism broke with the raison d'etat of the mercantile state by arguing for the existence of economic processes as a reality over which the sovereign could not exercise the same kind of power that he exercised over its subject by means of the law. Economic processes, such as famine and its relation to the trade in grains, had their own rationality, which demanded a specific kind of knowledge, such as political economy, and a specific kind of action, that is a kind of laissez-faire. The notion of civil society, which, Foucault adds, will quickly become society tout court and become identified eventually with the nation, fulfills for him the necessity to avoid that the art of government split into two irreconcilable branches. The notion of society brought together the art of governing economically and the art of governing juridically, in ways that preserved the unity and generality of the art of governing over the whole sphere of sovereignty, while at the same time keeping the specificity and autonomy of the art of governing with respect to economics. Such society could become the whole, which then comprised and held together different domains, such as the political, the economic, the cultural, and so on. In complementing the domain of the law and the economy, the notion of civil society, in particular, acquired specific characteristics, which for Foucault are exemplified in a very popular text from 1762, Adam Ferguson's Essay on the History of Civil Society, a text which was very close to Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, where the word nation, says Foucault, has more or less the same meaning. These meanings will come to constitute the main features of liberal notions of society. That society, for Ferguson, is an historical natural constant. And here, he disagrees with Hobbes, because for Ferguson and the liberals, there is no such a thing as a state of nature before the constitution of society. For Ferguson and post-Hobbesian liberal thinkers, human history has always existed taken in groups, because the nature of human nature is to be social, and the social bond develops spontaneously. It is the state of nature that requires that men live in the social state or in a society. On the other hand, what joined individuals together in civil society, for Adam Ferguson, was a mechanism which, for Foucault, was similar or analogous and different to that used to ground the theory of the market, that is, the spontaneous self-interest of individuals. If the market coordinates for the benefit of all the myriad actions rooted in economic interest, what ensures that individuals become part of a society are not economic interests, that is, maximum profit from exchange, but disinterested interest, such as instinct, sentiment, and sympathy. And Foucault adds, the impulses of benevolence individuals feel for each other, but also the loathing of others, repugnance for the misfortune of individuals, but also the pleasure taken in the misfortune of others, with whom one will break. A distinct interplay of non-egoist, disinterested interests, which is much wider than egoism itself. Foucault, that is, points out how the liberal notion of civil society, and then society and the nation, grounds an economic subject into a specific space of belonging, civil society as a limited ensemble, as one particular ensemble among others, which does not coincide with humanity in general. As Foucault puts it, it exists in the forms of ensemble at the same or different levels, which bring individuals together in a number of units and lead the individual to enlist on the side of one tribe or community. Civil society, he concludes, is not humanitarian, but communitarian. It appears in the family, village, and corporation, and occurs at higher levels, reaching that of the nation, in Adam Smith's sense, the nation being one of the major forms, but only one of the possible forms of civil society. What follows is that liberal democracies maintain a notion of society which is inherently exclusive, linking sovereignty, territory, and populations through the extension of limited bonds of sympathy and averse feelings of antipathies relative to the space of the nation. As critical race theorist Denise Ferreira da Silva has recently observed, this also corresponded to the specific construction of the global as a space that is constituted by a number of populations connecting specific racial and later ethnic characteristics to specific territories. As da Silva observed, this construction of the global space is not just a matter of feelings, but also entails an epistemic division between those regions of the world, or societies, in my terms, which are located in transparency, that is, Western nations that embody the rational principle of self-determination, and other regions which are placed in affectability, whose subjects are instead ruled by some racial or later ethnic affections, and which stand in front of the Western subject as incapable of self-determination. This notion of society is still proving almost an insurmountable internal limit to the development of the Kantian project of a cosmopolitics, a project that I return to later on when I consider Hong Kong philosopher Yu Qiu's notion of cosmotechnics. The notion of society as a limited ensemble is not only unable to help us rethinking the project of a planetary society to which we must tend as a species if we want to survive and overcome the challenges of the growth of global warming and increasing economic dispossession. But it's also, I believe, itself challenged by the very mutation of that on which the notion of society depended to acquire an objective reality. I call this mutation the hypersocial, to identify both a change in the construction of the social as quantitative abstraction and its relation to contemporary forms of corporate governmentality, such as Facebook notions of global community, which they came up with a few years ago. So this is a map that, as you will see, it's very selective, right? There are all kind of bits missing. And it became implemented in the institution of Facebook groups and in various global community summits organized by Facebook in Chicago in 2016, at the point where the company was very much in trouble with Congress about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. What I'm interested in is also the way in which this kind of genealogy of society as a transactional reality also can be complemented with the question of the social, which is slightly different than that of society. As British sociologists such as Mary Povey and Nicholas Ross put it, the fundamental nature of the social is to be something that they call a modern fact. Something whose existence depends on the possibility of a quantitative scientific abstraction. And so if the pre-existence of the society cannot be proven scientifically in a way, that of the social can, by use of statistics and other kinds of measure. Povey defined this modern fact as an epistemological unit rather than a content that links individual claims about specific observations with generalization about larger or deeper principles that lie behind the observed phenomenon. Abstractions like the social function within societies that have embraced the epistemology of the social fact, or the modern fact. As Gert Lewin put it, as one of the forefathers of social network analysis as late as the 1940s, social scientists, to be conceived of as such, have had to prove the existence of the social by means of methods akin to the natural sciences, thus placing the unconscious of the social sciences in what George Steinmetz called methodological positivism. If the existence of society materializes as a correlate of the market within the space of the nation state, the social does not depend so much on this imaginative construction, but on the capacity to measure the forces that make up the social. If society implies the existence of a totality, the social implies a mode of knowing and measuring in the third person that makes the space of society governable. Both requires technologies, but of a different kind. Civil society is made of schools, the media, the public sphere, and so on, while the social requires social scientists and institutions able to collect data and produce facts about social order. It is a given of social theory that the social depends on the techniques and technologies, on tools of data collection. In this sense, the social sciences have been in the business of computation for a long time. The implication of computation, the social and society, goes back at least to the use of the tabulating machine called Hollerith machine in processing data of the US Census in 1890, which in 1924 will be incorporated into the International Business Machine, or IBM. A few decades earlier, Marx himself had needed economic data to make his case about the social nature of value and production. In this sense, the social is not just a quantitative abstraction, but also that which reveals the existing of something that exceeds the individual, as in Durkheim's notion of the social fact. And on the basis of this, it also became the name in the name of which struggle could be carried out. So it is on this basis that the transformation of a quantitative abstraction into a transactional reality can become also a special domain of intervention of the state and the engine of political struggle. This notion of the social enjoyed its maximum development between 1920s and 1970s. It was an hegemonic concept grounding political projects as different as national socialism, social democracy, and socialism. It was this social, then, that it seemed to end in the late 1970s from Baudrillard, a decade before the fall of the Berlin Wall, which established the kind of decline of socialism as a political rationality, giving in its place the extension of economic and market-based principle to all domains, including social life, as in the theory of human capital. The development that we are dealing with in our current conjuncture is the return of the social. This has started since the late 2000s, when it made a surprising comeback, but in a form and shape that seemed to everybody to definitely break with the collective social of the 1920s, 1970s period. The social made a comeback as the social network, as was called at the time by Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who described his company as being based in the social graph, a database connecting in the form of network all users' profiles on his platform. The social graph became the new image of the social, a mathematical representation of social connection in graph-like or network form that has quickly become the dominant model of networked connectivity. Since the late 2000s, in fact, the web-based model of hyperlinking, which connected pages, has been overlayered with a digital social network space, imposing social network topologies over computer network topologies and then computational topologies altogether. From a socio-technical point of view, the hypersocial defines the process by which an algorithmic mutation of the hyperlink, which used to connect pages or documents, started to connect not just users' profiles in social network, but all kinds of digital objects which are associated to profiles by actions such as liking or sharing, and then become part of this kind of data space, becoming a computational service, which now is increasingly identified as the social. Starting on the web, the digital social network has accelerated its recoding of the social with a shift to cellular telephony and the transformation of the mobile phone into a powerful computational device provided with sensors such as cameras, microphones, movement sensors, geolocation, and so on. Social media platforms have accelerated the process whereby the social has been turned into a computational surface generated by massive real-time recording and processing of data. This new accessibility of real-time data has converged with larger and slightly older processes of digitization of all kinds of records, longer, modern, larger, from biogenomic databases to financial databases, credit cards, transactions, and such likes, which has made possible the resurgence of the project of artificial intelligence through approaches-based machine learning. I have to check the time. Do I have another 20 minutes? Okay, so I'm gonna give you a break and I'm gonna take myself a break. Okay, so elsewhere in other talks, I have repeatedly discussed the genealogy of the social network diagram, because I did not agree with the idea that the social network diagram was just another case of network imperialism. You know, it's in the argument that everything has become a network and all networks are kind of interchangeable. Studying the social network, I came to understand that it has its own very specific trajectory in the history of the globe, or the globe more than the planet, because it's a very racialized gender history. It has a specific trajectory in the social sciences, where, since the 1920s, has been presented as an alternative model of the social with comparison to the standard tools of social analysis, such as the statistical survey. So social network theorists accuse sociologists of using the statistical survey as a kind of meat grinder, which reduced the social fabric, that is the patterns of relations, to a statistical aggregate where nothing can interact with anybody, anything else. The social network diagram, in fact, emerges in the heyday of the social between the 1920s and 1970s, when it was invented as a mean to scientifically map social structure. And all the measures of position and ranking that we see applied today in social media were kind of tried out first by social scientists working on the field. I'm thinking in particular about its early inception in social anthropology, with Reginald Radcliffe Brown's studies of the Aboriginal Mergins tribes in Australia in the 1920s, where he describes the task of the social anthropologist as that of making the invisible social world or structure of tribal societies visible in ways that could help colonial administration to reform itself after the earlier stage of conquest where physical anthropology was good enough. Or I'm thinking about the use of sociometry and social network diagrams by Hungarian-American psychiatrist Jacopo Moreno, the inventor of game role-play in group therapy, who started out, who got this idea about measuring the patterns of social relation when he was a young doctor working at Mitterndorf at a refugee camp, hosting Austrian citizens who lived in Italy. At the time, there was this contention between the border. But his main work on sociometry was carried out in prisons as part of the movement of social reform of the prison system, breaking down amid epidemics of fugitivity and rioting. So he developed it in his work on Sing Sing prison and the Hudson School for Girls in upstate New York, an institution which is featured prominently in Saidiya Hartman's recent book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, where black girls or disobedient girls, ungovernable girls would be sent without need for a real trial, just for being unruly. Or I'm also thinking about the drafting of social network analysis in the so-called Hawthorne Factory study in Chicago, which was one of the first studies of industrial productivity, where social network analysts trained by Radcliffe Brown uncovered that relationships between workers were used to slow down the working of the assembly machine, to slow down the speed. In short, I become intrigued by the ways in which the social network started as part of projects of social reforms, aiming at making more efficient colonial administrations, or failing disciplinary institutions, riotous prisons, reformatories where girls kept running away, factories where workers slow down productivity, and so on. So I come to understand the social network as having a governmental genealogy, which was mostly developed by the state, but also by corporations at some point, including the colonial state in its attempt to rationalize its control of colonized societies. Social network analysis was later developed at Harvard University in the 1970s, which by no chance is where Facebook started. Later, and this transformation was interesting in the 70s because this is where the logic of the social network as a model of society became an economic logic, adopting economic models of subjectivity such as social exchange theory, making social networking synonymous with accumulating social capital. So when you do social networking in the 1980s, so you're looking for a job or you're looking for connection. And this is the way that the term is deployed by Samuel R. Delany, African-American novelist and essayist, in his account of the story of Times Square, Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. However, in its deployment today as the mathematical engine of hypersociality, it would not be possible without a shift from small groups and communities, which were the focus of early social network analysis, to the modeling of the interactions of large populations, introduced by the appropriation of the field by mathematical biologists and by physicists at the turn of the millennium, significantly using data from web browsers, which is where the kind of all the speech about all the ideas of power laws and social physics developed. So the epistemic and technical infrastructure has today been grafted on top of the early semantic web technologies in privatized protocols such as Facebook's Open Graph, which uses graph theory and social network analysis to construct these maps that I was mentioning before. Users' profiles become nodes of a huge virtual matrix of associations, which include not just profiles, but also their relations, extending the kind of human-centered social network analysis of the 1920s, 1970s to a space of all kinds of inhuman, real or invented objects. The computational surface and communication infrastructure that I call the hypersocial is thus creating new patterns of belonging and identification, and new ways of acting on the social, which are intensifying at the moment the kind of the old communitarian meaning of civil society, that's intensifying kind of polarization, intensifying strife, while at the same time providing new strategies of social control. The hypersocial diagrams brings together social production and reproduction, labor and culture, and the kind of governmental technology that is corporate, but which national governments are also learning how to use. So there is a kind of a shifting of corporate logic into governmental strategies. So what I would like to bring up today with you, so this is something I discussed in other conferences, is a different point, which is more in the spirit of the symposium. So it's not so much about the governmental genealogy of the social network diagram and the way it's being deployed to reinvent social governmentality by corporations such as Facebook, and the way governments are kind of also feeding into this. But it's about the idea that whether it's still possible or desirable to reclaim this hypersocial, to reclaim this new way of computationally describing, defining the social and its associated structures of feeling in today's network culture. What I'm wondering is, whether the hypersocial could be thought in terms that can be more responsive to a leftist political imagination, either progressive or reparative, as we heard yesterday. If corporate platforms are both reinventing social governmentality by means of automation, combining it with profit-making, they're also clearly unable to steer humanity out of the entangled economic, political, and ecological crises that are the cause of great suffering for many today, both humans and not humans, as in the Australian fires of the last few weeks. This reclaiming needs to be, in the terms used yesterday, both material and symbolic, and maybe also ideal, but maybe in the sense in which mathematics is ideal. This will also give a new twist to current debates about these platforms, where everything is about privacy and surveillance and how to reclaim your data, without a vision of what kind of planetary society, a model of entangled planetary society, which this technology are producing, could we derive that is not, that is kind of takes a different direction, bifurcates from the current model of the hypersocial that we are living with. A few years ago, I wrote a piece called Restack Attack, Algorithms, Capital, and the Automation of the Common. It was written at the convergence of the theoretical and political inquiry on militant research in Italy, free university networks, which I also share with Matteo, such as Uninomade and Euronomade, that developed the political ideas of the French-Italian autonomist or post-workerist Marxism. So under the influence of that moment, I argued that the notion of the common, conceived as a political alternative to private property, based in social cooperation rather than competition between isolated individuals, required a machinic infrastructure. Today, I feel that this machinic infrastructure as such is not enough. they also need a kind of symbolic grasp on an idea of the social and society that is not a simple reproposition of late 19th and 20th century models of the social. The corporate internet today performs the hypersocial as this computational surface drawn by artificial intelligence, as a tool of economic government that produces at the same time social order, even if unstable, and economic profit. It's not a stable machine. It breaks down and it breaks us down very often, especially when it tries to perform society as global community. It lends itself to manipulation and propaganda. Zeynep Tufekci, the Turkish sociologist, has taught us that the governments have learned how to use social media platform to seed confusion, and that they benefit from the kind of wild running away of conspiracy theorists. So they produce polarization and civil war, while at the same time increasing and feeding the ongoing condition of planetary non-separability or entanglement. I would say that the hypersocial as a mode of planetarization needs to break with the global as a previous mode of planetarization that marked the attempted overcoding of the space of national societies by the market. Today's crisis expose the crisis of the global and the nation as specific ways of imagining society, while at the same time increasing this feeling of not being able to be separate from anything else, to split off. Global corporations are not the solution, but neither nation states or federation of nation states. So I'm interested in how the hypersocial as a concept can help, which is kind of drenched in this history of struggles and commoning, and then transformed by this computational machine, can help us to imagine a kind of modern planetary society beyond globalization and return to the nation states. Finally, I would like to conclude by briefly referring to Hong Kong philosopher Yuk Nui's notion of cosmotechnics, which he published a book about, and also it's an article in eFlux. Yuk Nui proposed that the end of unilateral globalization that we are living today, with its multiple power centers, the US, China, Russia, the European Union, competing for world hegemony in this kind of technological arms race, requires that we rethink the notion of cosmopolitics developed by Kant in a different way. Kant's cosmopolitics implied a relation between the human, the moral law, and the cosmos that was specific to Western epistemologies, and that implied a universalization of the Western experience, of the European in particular. He also, however, takes issue with the ontological turn in anthropology, which proposes to particularize European epistemology, such as naturalism or the opposition between nature and culture, as one amongst many, for the danger of claiming for a return to indigenous knowledges as the kind of alternative to European notion. Yui argues for the necessity of thinking cosmopolitics together with technology, or reopening the question of cosmopolitics by returning to the question of technology. I would like to add to this perspective that it is not only a question of multiplying culturally different ways of thinking technology, but also seeing if within the current technological configuration of the social, it is possible to glimpse the potential emergence of a new cosmotechnical relation between the social and the planetary. Thank you.